Yep. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for attending. Right, so today we're going to be talking about change and quality with Vault PLM. So this is probably my favorite part of Fusion Lifecycle and the whole Vault PLM combination, just because it's something that it's functionality that takes something that's often very opaque and hard to manage and makes it incredibly transparent and I think ultimately really easy to execute. So what we're talking about today is we're going to see how the change process would work in Fusion Lifecycle and how it's a closed loop process, how all the various activities related to a change get linked together for both transparency and productivity and efficiency. We'll take a real brief glimpse at reporting. We don't really have time to do it justice fully, but it's sort of the extension of executing all this stuff. The idea is once you start executing in something like Fusion Lifecycle, you can then start to draw, you know, conclusions and be more proactive instead of reactive because you've got more information at your fingertips. So that's the idea today. We're going to talk about change and quality. And we're going to try to keep this shorter. My webcasts usually run about an hour. We're going to try to keep it hopefully around a half hour today because we have so many of these coming up. I want you to be able to attend these, all of them if you've got time, or make it a little more bite-sized if you need to watch it later on. But today, again, today's February 17th. We'll be talking about change in quality. Over the next 3 weeks, we'll be talking about other topics with Vault PLM, bills of material, new product introduction, and supplier management. But again, today we're talking about change. Now, there are any number of reasons why change might happen in your processes. And everybody has a slightly different idea of what change is, depending on your role within the organization, what industry you're in, right? A really common term is ECO. There are lots of acronyms in the world. ECO is a really common one. It might mean different things to different people, right? It could be an engineering change order. That's what I would typically use that specific acronym to mean, would be an engineering change order. But some people do ECRs, engineering change requests. You know, often at some point in any process, there's the concept or the idea of an ECN, like a change notice. You know, some people might call it an enterprise change order versus an engineering change order. For some people, it's an emergency change order. For some people, every change is an emergency, right? So, but fundamentally, we're talking about change, whatever you call it. And change is really, for most companies that experience workflow challenges, and I think most of us can agree we all have processes that could be a little better, managing change is pretty much right there at the top. You know, based on some survey data, you know, over half of companies have reported managing change being their top challenge, right? And that's understandable, right? Because by its very nature, change almost always involves at least two people. Sometimes it could be a whole group of people. It often involves different groups within the company. It can involve customers or vendors. There are a lot of people involved. Decisions have to be made. Information's got to be shared. There's a lot going on when it comes to change, and managing that effectively can be very challenging. So that's what we're talking about today. That's what we're going to talk about, how Fusion Lifecycle could help you manage that a little better, maybe a lot better, depending on your situation, right? So the idea is we can avoid bottlenecks using software. We can give you the right information at your fingertips, all of the information you need to make decisions, but also only the information that's relevant to you given the task at hand. And that's one of the great things about Fusion Lifecycle, and I think how the default tenant is arranged is it divides this very complex task up into a logical series of subtasks that those responsible for executing a part of the overall change process can focus in on exactly what their role is and what they're supposed to do, while those of us who need to see a broader view of the entire change can still easily get all of that information. So Vault PLM, we talked about this last week. There's a lot that it can do. That's part of why we've divided this up into several webcasts, because there's just too much to talk about at any one point in time. But again, change management, quality management, and we're going to talk about how that even filters all the way down to Vault and even down into our actual CAD application. So this is a completely vertically integrated solution from the highest level where a change might need to be decided on, all the way down to the person in the CAD product executing something as a result of all of those higher level decisions. So that means we've got to get product data involved, we've got to get people involved, and we need a process to govern that whole thing. And that's what PLM is, and that's what Fusion Lifecycle can bring you. You know, if we look at this kind of thing in schematic form, you know, that kind of gives us a sense of the complexity of these things, right? We might have something that engineering discovers while they're reviewing a design, where they raise a problem that, you know, leads to a request for a change, which then becomes a change order. You're actually going to execute the change. There are tasks associated with that. You know, that could have impacts on inventory. It could impact equipment used to manufacture products. It could come from a customer. If a product makes it out to a customer and there's a problem, they may report a problem, which then filters back through the same process. Maybe it comes from field service. But the idea is we need to have an effective means of reacting to change, reacting to problems, to make sure we deliver a quality product, not just delivering it from our dock, but maintaining that level of quality when it gets into customers' hands, resolving things quickly so that our brand improves in people's minds. It doesn't suffer. So to facilitate this view and this discussion, I want to take a minute and talk about how Fusion Lifecycle works under the hood. Think of Fusion Lifecycle as a furnished apartment. It's your own area in the cloud, in this case. And that area of the cloud is made up of what we call workspaces. Now, everything in Fusion Lifecycle, every container, you might call it, bit of like bucket of information, is what we would call a workspace. Now, a given tenant is made up of several workspaces, maybe dozens or several dozen, depending on what you have it doing for you. And in turn, those workspaces all have the potential to behave in different ways. There's a common set of tools, but they all have generally a unique behavior or a goal. There's a reason they exist. It could be to capture problem reports. Right? If someone reports a problem, they need to provide details about the problem. Maybe they need to share some pictures of something. They need to maybe attach some documents. And there needs to be a workflow to ensure that that problem report gets properly received and evaluated, and if necessary, causes some execution to resolve that problem. So each of these workspaces also has uniquely named or numbered records so that everything has a unique identifier within the system. And any one of these workspaces can have whatever properties that they might need to carry to affect their behavior or to reach their goal. And there's a common set of behaviors or tools within the workspace that could be applied. Item details is where you store all the metadata about that object, that problem report, or that change order. We can attach documents. We can have a bill of materials structure. We can have tasks, or we could have workflow, right? Which is really what we're going to focus on today. So every workspace within the tenant can have workflow, and they can have their own uniquely defined workflow. And a workflow is just a collection of states and transitions between those states. So what we're looking at here on the screen is the default workflow for a change order, right? So a change order gets created, it gets reviewed. If it gets approved, there's some actual work that's done to affect the change. That work ideally is then reviewed, and then everyone agrees we're ready to approve it, and that change becomes effective, right? So this workflow for a change order could look completely different from the workflow for the problem report, which is essentially, the report's received, it's evaluated, and then if it's accepted, then that could trigger a change order. So the idea is that these workspaces, they don't exist completely in a vacuum. They're all in the tenant together. And so you might have a workspace that would be a problem report. You might have a workspace that would be a change order. And then you might have a workspace that would represent a part or an item. These things can be linked together so that a problem report, as it goes through its workflow, triggers a change order, which might even include a series of tasks that then eventually populates and pushes information or manipulates information on the actual part number record. And the way that washes out in how the software looks, and I'm going to show you the software here in just a minute, is we compartmentalize these behaviors or goals into these workspaces so that anyone using the software can, if they're browsing through the workspaces themselves, can go right to the thing that they either need to look at or work on or create. I've got a problem, I need to issue a problem report. I go and do a problem report. If I need to request a deviation because we don't have time to affect some change, I go create a deviation, right? These are all completely configurable. It's the amazing thing about Fusion Lifecycle. There's some fantastic default behavior in the tenant that a lot of companies can make very good use of. If you need that behavior to be different, the odds are good we can make it behave the way you need it to. So talking about that default behavior in a tenant, let's take a look at it. This is a fairly comprehensive, it's not 100%, but a fairly comprehensive view of all of the different workspaces in the tenant. So if you were to get Fusion Lifecycle today, get your tenant, log in, you would see most of these and maybe some other workspaces. So again, each of these has a reason for existing. And when we're talking about change management, we're really talking about this area over here. Notice, by the way, that they're all really connected. Not a single one of these stands alone. So when we're talking about change management specifically, let's say a problem report comes up. So it could be someone on the floor notices an assembly problem, someone in engineering notices an issue with the design. They could create a problem report. That problem report could lead to either a CAPA, a corrective and preventive action activity, or if it's something simple, maybe it could just be go straight to a change request. That request could lead to a change order, which then eventually leads to a change to an item or a bill of materials. So that's the idea. So before we get into looking at the software, I do have one poll question. I'd like to get a little bit of feedback because I'm really curious how people watching manage change today. Now, I didn't put an other choice on this poll. Hopefully I captured the way most everyone interacts with or handles change in their environment. Email is these days often the most common, so I would consider that also email with like spreadsheets sitting out on a network or something. Your communication is largely, I found a problem, let me send an email. Some people do have software solutions in place. Maybe they're doing it through an ERP system. Maybe you're doing it through Vault. A lot of people still use paper. In environments where things are simple, maybe it's just word of mouth. Maybe someone comes in the office and says, hey, I found a problem. Engineer does some work to a CAD drawing and goes and hands it off, right? I would say most people do need to manage change. If you're not really working with products and you really do like one-off equipment, change is certainly typically less important in your environment. But ultimately, even when I was doing design and build custom equipment, inevitably there would be something would happen even when we got into the build phase where we would need to change something, right? So even if it's very informal, change still happens until you get that product out the door, and then even until that product gets, if it's a custom equipment, until that thing gets decommissioned, there's always a chance that something's going to change. All right, so great. So thank you for participating in that poll. As I expected, the vast majority of people watching do it electronically via email. That is by far the most common thing. You get an email saying, hey, something needs to change, and then hopefully that email gets seen and something happens to affect that change. So what I'd like to do now is show you how it could happen in Fusion Lifecycle. So what we see up here on the screen is Fusion Lifecycle. This is in a browser. I've just hidden the menu bar to give us more screen real estate. And what you see here, this is my home screen. I have various things up here. I have my what I would call KPIs up here, key performance indices. We'll get to that just briefly when we talk about reporting. If I've got some outstanding work, things that are on my list to do, I've got these here in the middle. And I've got bookmarks down here at the bottom, things that I'd really like to be able to get back to quickly, like this problem report. So this is a problem report in Fusion Lifecycle. This is part of the default tenant. And the idea of this problem report is that we can track problems. So if someone with access to the system sees a problem, they can come to Fusion Lifecycle, they can create one of these problem reports. The idea is they create it, they fill some information out, a description, and then they could pass it along to the point where it gets reviewed. So you field it, do we have enough information? Is this really a problem? From there, it could go to a technical review phase where we really decide, is this really a problem? Do we need to investigate this further, right? And then at least starting the idea of how are we actually going to resolve this issue. Now, when it comes to deciding how we're going to resolve it, the default tenant gives us a couple different ways to do that. We could either, if it's a relatively simple change we're going to have to affect, maybe we create what's called an ECR, a change request. So this is essentially going maybe to engineering saying, okay, we have this problem, it's relatively simple. We just need to figure out how we're going to fix this and fix it. Or if we think it's a more serious issue or maybe a more wide-ranging issue, we could create what's called a CAPA, a corrective and preventive action. Now, in this case of this specific change, We had somebody at a customer site. They were actually at the customer site and they found this problem. They could have called up on their phone and filled this thing out right away, right? Don't have to wait to get back to the office and look at some scribbled notes to figure out what's going on. They could even take a picture and eventually upload that to Fusion Lifecycle. But in this case, they found an issue. There's some sealant on the machines causing some leaks, caused some trouble. Yeah, the equipment, it's marginal in terms of where the operating conditions, but it's still technically in spec. And when eventually we look through this problem report and we do the technical review, it seems, okay, yes, that all looked good. It looks like maybe it's an issue with the sealant itself. We use this in a lot of different places. We should probably figure out if that's going to be a more wide-ranging problem. But what's interesting about the workflow here in Fusion Lifecycle is when we get to this technical review phase, and I can show this more clearly on one that's still open, we have a choice here of whether we create an ECR or a kappa, and that actually derives from our details here. So when we are working through this change or this report and filling out this information, we can make a decision, someone can make a decision and say, yes, we're going to affect a kappa at the end of this, or an ECR at the end of this. Depending on what we've selected here, our available workflow action is to create a kappa. So we can't really do something accidentally wrong. We all agreed it was going to be a kappa. When I go to approve this, I can't accidentally do an ECR, right? It's going to do a kappa. Again, this is all out of the box behavior. I do want to stress too, this may look very complex. Keep in mind, this is built to facilitate really about the most complex change you can imagine, with lots of different people involved. It is absolutely possible to simplify this workflow. You wouldn't have to use a kappa. You could always go straight to an ECR. You could always just go and straight create ECOs, like we'll see in a minute. So this will look complex, but it can be simplified if you need it to. The key is the complexity is there if you need it. Now, back to our original issue that in this case has already been closed. In the interest of time, I wanted to have something we could just, review, after the fact. When I look at the details of this, the kappa has already been created. This issue has actually been worked and is closed. I have a link to that kappa down here. I don't have to go and search for the next step in the change, right? So if you remember, we started with a problem report, and now we're ready to move on to the kappa phase. So this is where we actually do more investigation about the problem, right? And this has its own workflow, right? It's in progress. Maybe we need to create a deviation so that we can continue working on the existing equipment while we're trying to resolve this problem. Eventually, we review the kappa, and then that's going to kick off our ECR that starts to help us affect the change, right? But we can look at what happened with this kappa over time. What we said we're going to do is we don't want to ship any more of these things with this bad sealant, right? So our containment plan is, this is what we need to do. So if anybody's curious about, well, isn't that a change? What's going on with that? They could come here and say, okay, yeah, we decided we're not going to ship any of these things until it's done, right? We have an area here of the kappa to identify causes, right? And all of these things can be folded up. Like if I don't care about how we're containing it, I just want to know what we're deciding to do, I could look at all of these, right? So, we've determined that it's actually an issue with the sealant itself. The sealant we're getting from this particular supplier is sometimes marginal and sometimes falls out of spec, right? So how we decide to resolve that problem is, well, we could find a different supplier that has better QA, or we could switch to a different sealant that has a higher sealing for the environment we're working in. That way, even if there is some variation, we don't have an issue with something on the floor, right? And the idea of this is to capture all of this information so that people making decisions have this information at their fingertips, right? And eventually it gets decided that yes, while it would be more expensive to replace this with a different grade of sealant, ultimately that's going to completely solve the problem. We don't have to worry about it causing problems in the future. Let's just do it, right? So we move on now to the ECR phase, right? So, and that happens automatically, by the way, just by executing this workflow change. When we say we approve it, the ECR automatically gets created in the system, right? So now I could go and look here and see, here's the related change request. We're starting to run a little short on time, so I'm going to go through this just a little quickly. But ultimately, this led to a change order that then eventually makes a change to the actual underlying bill of materials object. So the idea is we went through a problem report that led to a CAPA. It could have led straight to a change request, right? That then ultimately led to a change order that then ultimately impacts the item, and we revise that bill of materials that contains that sealant. Right? So again, this is complex, but it can be modified if necessary to make it less complex. And the complexity is there if you need it. And again, one of the keys here is this available anywhere. Like I said, that issue that we found on the floor at the customer site, I didn't have to wait to get back to my laptop or wait to get back to my office. I could pull up my phone right there and start that problem report. So immediately that gets visibility, and I capture the information right while I'm there. So I know I've got everything that I need to affect that change throughout the rest of the organization. Right? And so the workflow engine in Fusion Lifecycle is really what makes this whole process possible. We can customize those workflows. Notifications are involved in every step. Reminders, which are incredibly crucial, for me personally at least, are baked in. You can escalate things. Delegation, go on vacation. You don't want to get pinged with a whole bunch of emails and responsibilities, ideally. You can delegate things to people while you're out so that they get the tasks and it goes to them. You can force people to say what they're thinking. And then the idea of electronic signatures too, to help with compliance. And then of course, in addition to the change order functionality that's built in, there's a whole app store full of what are essentially just workspaces that can be added to your tenant to introduce additional behavior.
We can hear you now.
So that's great, that's neat, cool functionality. I personally think it's amazing. What does that mean? Well, think about how you do change today. Most of us, as we said, do it electronically through email. So you might get an email saying there's a problem. So I go and open up a spreadsheet and save a copy as and start filling it out. And hopefully I change everything that I was supposed to. You know, if it's still paper-based, maybe you've got a copy of a fax of a form that you can almost read with coffee stains and oil stains and all that kind of stuff. But what do you think is easier to manage, this or this, right? Clean software, fields that you can fill out that all have little icons for more information if you need it. Requirements to fill out information versus just hoping people get the right information, right? So that's change, but how does that impact quality? Well, quality is really just what it boils down to in my mind is ensuring quality means as problems come up, they get effectively resolved. So we have this engine for change that we just looked at, and quality is just feeding that engine in a different way. We might have a nonconformance as a result of an inspection, right? That could lead to a CAPA, which filters through the rest of the process. Or we might have an RMA or a report from a customer, right? Which then could lead to a CAPA, which then filters through the rest of the process, right? So that's how quality and change really go hand in hand. And just briefly about reporting, I do want to make a little note of the reporting. If we take a look back at Fusion Lifecycle, if I go to my home page or my dashboard, I have this concept of charts. Up here, I have some laid out specifically related to change. Here are the current change orders we have by state. We've got 10 approved. We have 5 that are still in the create stage. We got them in various stages. These can be bar charts. They can be pie charts. They can be essentially spreadsheets like Excel. You can get better views, really explore these things, even save it out to a PDF, right? Or an image and throw that right into a presentation, right? But since it's cloud-based, if you've got internet, you don't even need to take a screen capture and say, this is what it looked like 2 days ago when I made this report, right? I could call up Fusion Lifecycle and immediately say, this is what it looks like right now. This is what it looked like as of when I hit that button, right? So this is the beauty of reporting on a system like this, is you're not running a report that's based on some data that was dumped into, a database, offline database built for reporting purposes. This is reporting on the live data. You get an immediate snapshot of what things look like. Okay. And so this whole series, we're talking about Vault PLM. How does Vault play into this? Well, we've got this whole idea of change. Remember the change order part of our workflow? Well, that workflow in Fusion Lifecycle can feed down to a change order in Vault through the connecting software. So now it's in our CAD world, right? It's in our Vault. And that change can then filter down right into Inventor, right? So Vault can tag the actual CAD files as being under change, and we can actually display that information right inside Inventor. So someone in Fusion Lifecycle says something needs to change. That ultimately filters down just by people doing their everyday job down to an engineer in CAD, in Canvas, being able to see exactly which 3 components as part of a very complex assembly need to be revised, right? That full stack of visibility and effectivity all the way down the chain. And then they do their part, make the CAD document changes, close up their change order in Vault. That can then filter back up to Fusion Lifecycle to continue the process, and eventually everything becomes effective throughout the organization. All right, so again, today we're keeping it a little shorter than usual, try to make these more bite-sized, but just to review what we've talked about, there are any number of things that can lead to the need for something to change, right? We need a flexible, a mobile way to manage these changes with the entire enterprise in mind, not just engineering. We need visibility, we need traceability. Email does not get us there, right? All of these things can be connected. Quality and change, all the various tasks that go into it can be made visible through something like Fusion Lifecycle. So you can really take that email-based process that you're using today, digitize it just a little more. You're already using software, it's just Outlook, but no longer having to search through your email to try to find out what that request was. Someone goes in the system, they make the request, it goes, yes, you get an email still, you can get a reminder, but it's also on your task list. You also can get a reminder email if it slips in terms of, delivery time. You get that full range of visibility and traceability. All right, so I hope this was helpful in understanding a little bit more about change and specifically how change would be affected in Fusion Lifecycle. So just as a reminder, what's coming, next week we'll be talking about bills of material, followed by new product introduction and managing supplier information. And again, all of those will be on Wednesdays at 9 a.m. Pacific, 11 Central, 12 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Mountain. All right, and with that, we will address some questions. So first question, is there a solution for ITAR sensitive data that couldn't be kept in the typical cloud? That I'm not aware of. Let me look into that. It is always cloud-based no matter what. Whether there's the ability to have it in some sort of special segment of the cloud that would be technically ITAR compliant, or how ITAR in general, I should say, works with this. Let me get some more information on that, because I don't want to speak without full knowledge on whether it can be inherently made ITAR compliant or whether there's something specific that would need to be done or whether it just wouldn't apply. So let me get back to you on that, Carl. The next question, what does CAPA stand for? The words I use would be corrective and preventive action, right? So the idea of a CAPA is that you have a defined process. So let's get one up here to facilitate explaining what these guys are. You have a defined process for resolving, completely managing the need for something to change. Not only fixing the problem, but keeping it from happening again, right? So there's a team of people associated with that, and you need to define the problem. You need to define how you're going to contain the problem before you end up with a final resolution, right? You need to make sure you fully understand the cause. You need to determine, if necessary, what permanent action is going to be taken to prevent the problem from happening again. And then you need to make sure that it is properly implemented and that implementation, that you validated that the solution is effective. And then you need to define what are you going to do to keep it from happening again. So this is a very formal process. Not everybody needs it. It can be way too complex for simple changes. But if it's a serious change that has cost you serious time and or serious money, which are essentially the same thing, this gives everyone in the organization visibility into what happened. What happened? Why did it happen? How are we going to keep this thing from happening again? And how do we sure it's not going to happen again? All of those things can be captured here. And we can see exactly who weighed in, what they had to say about it, and whenever. We have a complete audit trail on every one of these records in Fusion Lifecycle, immediately available. Okay, so we have had some more questions come in. That's fantastic. It's great that people were paying attention. What if we don't use the ECO capability of Vault? How does Fusion Lifecycle handshake with Vault and eventually down to the CAD level? Well, in that case, what you could do if you don't use the change order functionality, if you're using the item behavior, ultimately the interaction between Fusion Lifecycle and Vault can be customized in whatever way that you need. Ultimately, the need for change, and I'll admit I'm not 100% sure of everything that the Fusion Lifecycle to Vault connector can do. Ultimately, how you would get visibility down to the CAD level would be that the item records in Vault and the file records in Vault would change state. That's how it works inside the CAD product, because that little display in the CAD environment, this is really just reporting on what's happening in in the vault. Now, this specific view is showing files that are controlled by a change order, right? So that's how this is coming into play. If you don't use that, you may not be able to see the visibility here right inside CAD. But what you would see is, ideally, if all these other things are released, the only files that you could even check out for edit would be the ones that need to change. So everything else would be locked, and like this assembly and these 3 parts that might need to change, everything else will have a padlock. So yeah, maybe you can't map it right onto the screen like this, but you'd only be allowed to change the things that actually needed to change. So another question, can I link items in CAPAs or ECOs or ECRs in Fusion Lifecycle to items in Vault? Absolutely. So that's a key part of the interconnection, is you have an item in your Vault item master that essentially has a direct equivalent to the items and BOMs workspace in Fusion Lifecycle. And the connection between the two can keep those in sync. New items created in Vault can be pushed up to Fusion Lifecycle. Revision levels, statuses can all be managed that way. So there is a one-to-one correlation generally between the two in terms of their item masters. Does the Fusion 360 app work with this? If so, how well does the app work relative to the system interface? Is it sufficient as a primary interface? So Fusion 360, that's a really good question. So the term Fusion is used in a lot of different ways. Now, Fusion 360 specifically is cloud-based CAD. And I believe right now, it's my understanding that there is no direct interface between Fusion 360 and Fusion Lifecycle, but it is on its way. There's going to be an app that would let you interact with the two. I think I saw, I don't know if I saw a preview of it or whatever, but I can get some more information, and I think that might play in more, especially to next week's topic of items and BOMs, where we actually, are drawing things in CAD, and that actually represents an item on a bill of materials or a full bill of materials. So I'll see if I can maybe work that into next week's presentation. Hopefully that answered the question. I can't really answer the part about how well does Fusion 360 work with Fusion Lifecycle, because I haven't gotten my hands on it yet, and I'm not sure if it's widely available, but as far as I know, it's coming. It's going to be an app that's available as part of Fusion 360. All right, so we've been doing questions now for about 5 minutes, 6 minutes or so. So I think we haven't seen anything else come in for a little bit. So I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up there.
Okay, well, thank you, Forrest, and thank you everyone for attending today. If you think of additional questions, you can simply reply to that confirmation or reminder email you received from GoToWebinar, and we can get those to Forrest or your sales rep to get your questions answered. Once again, there will be a short survey pop up as we close down today. And just a reminder, you will receive an email tomorrow, which will contain a link for the recording of today's presentation. And you can find any of our recordings on our on-demand tab and on our website. So thanks everyone for attending, and have a great day.